Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Writers Podcast. I have with me today guest writer Emil Rem, a self described eccentric, and I'm sure he'll explain why he has decided to label himself as such as we get into it. And Emil writes travel journals, and uh, given his background, which we'll also get into, I'm sure that we'll find out why he's able to make such interesting stories. And so, welcome on the show, Emil. How you doing?
Very well, and thank you for having me on.
Not a problem. And you've, as you said, you are a travel journal writer, and perhaps you could get in a little bit into how that came to be because of your life.
Uh, my father worked for the airlines in East Africa. My mother decided that he was a bum, decided to divorce him, and we were in a very small, close-knit Muslim family
Mm,
and community. And so as a result of that, she couldn't find any work. She couldn't speak English, and she didn't have any education. But she decided that she was going to make something of herself, which my father wouldn't. The only place she could go to was England, because England was then in charge of what was then Tanganyika, now Tanzania, East
mm,
Africa. And she was able to get a job as a nurse, training as a
mm,
nurse in England. And she took me with her. And so every holiday I got from the age of 5, I would get on a plane on my own and I'd fly to Africa to see my father. From the age of 12, he would send me a wad of tickets from to all parts of the world.
mm,
So I could go to Heathrow Airport beside Terminal 3. I'd have a wad of tickets. I'd be on standby. And then whatever was available, I would be on that plane to go there. And, it could be Mexico, it could be America, it could be Japan, wherever I was able to get a free ticket. Now, I
mm.
carried a little bag with about 4 or 5 days worth of clothing in it, and I would be able to put that stowaway up in the plane, so there wasn't any problem with luggage being lost or whatever I had.
Okay.
We had no money, we were poor, so I had a
Mm,
choice. Either I talked to someone on the plane, they'd invite me home, and they really spent a lot of time. I met a lot of generous people that way, or I would sleep on the airport floor. At that time, we were allowed to do that. I'd walk to town, I'd wander around, and then I'd come back to the airport to sleep at night. Now, at that
mm.
time, there were no there were no guides as you have today. All these beautiful books, guidebooks,
Right.
where they tell you where to go and what the best top 100 places were. So all I did
Mm,
was I spent my life wandering around everywhere in every street that I could, and that's what I did. And
mm.
more than anything, I didn't have a camera. We didn't have money for a camera or to spend the money developing the photos. So
Okay.
my mind worked like a video cam. So it would wander around from place to place, look at all the people around it. I
Mm.
would figure out where the locals ate their food, because to my mind, I felt that that was the cheapest place that I could find to eat. So I was totally immersed
Mm,
in the local people. I didn't do anything about writing about it or doing anything about it whatsoever. But
mm.
these memories must have been extremely sharp, because 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, I'm writing about them. And they're like, I traveled there last week. And the
Mm.
details that I remember, which are phenomenal. So when you
Wow.
go back to my writing, the writing is really about um, the secondary people on the streets that I write about.
Mm.
And I don't write in the first tense. I always write in the third person.
Okay.
So you'll see, instead of Emil, you'll see this is what he did, that is what he did. So the kind of people I'd write about would be, say, a yam seller in the middle of Africa, or
Mm.
a local taxi driver who couldn't speak English. And those were the basis of my stories.
Okay.
Now, I was brought up, my mum took me to England, but she couldn't look after me. She didn't have the money, and the nursing people had given her a home that she couldn't take me to. So she managed to get a working class English family who knew nothing about Africa to look after me, supposed to be for 2 weeks. It lasted for 12 years. So here I was thrown between, on the one hand, Church of England, which they really couldn't care less about whatsoever, but
Mhm.
yet I found comforting, and I loved all the hymns, and I love I love to read the Bible. And
Right.
then I would be pushed over, and they would give me a St. Christopher's cross because St. Christopher was the saint of travelers.
Right.
I'd get to Africa over summer and spend 2 months there with my father, and I'd be asked to take the St. Christopher's off, and I'd be asked to put green armbands on and immediately attend a Muslim religious classes. And I would have
Mm.
been about 12 or 13, and I'd be sitting with 5 year olds. And we were meant to learn 8 to 10 pages of the Quran, which was called our dua, as
Mm.
Ismailis. And so I would have that backwards and forwards. I'd be that
Mhm.
kind of a life in Africa, and then a completely total one in England. Now, about the time I turned 60, my youngest son was always asking me where he came from, and so on. The year or two before, my wife is Filipino. When I met in Calgary, took the boys and spent the whole summer in the Philippines with a family in the home that she was born in. And so they had a raft of experience of where the mother's side came from. But the young one was always interested about what I was doing.
Mm.
So one day, my wife decided to take the boys for summer to the Philippines, and I had 5 or 6 weeks to myself. I decided to go somewhere and write stories about my past because most of the people in my life were dying. And so I wanted to remember them at the same time when I pass that on to my kid who was interested. So I chose Cyprus, and I chose Greek Cyprus because of all the places in the world, this reminded me of home. I couldn't go back to Africa because in the 70s, all our properties were taken over by the government.
Mm.
There was a lot of, and quite rightly, there was a lot of prejudice against Asians, and so a lot of us, such as in Uganda with Idi Amin, were asked to leave within 24 hours.
Mm.
So I couldn't go back to Africa. So I went to Cyprus and I decided to write stories. Well, the first night I got there, I didn't know what I was going to write about or what I was going to do. So the
Mm.
first night I get to Larnaca. I chose Larnaca because that's the only place that British Airways fly to. So okay, so the choice was made to go to Larnaca. Then there was a little village, a little sea village, which is about 20 minutes away by car from Larnaca, called Pila, Pyla. I thought I'd stay there. I just booked one night, thinking to myself that in summer, all the students come in from Europe and they have a party, and I don't want to be somewhere where it was loud. I just wanted to have some peace and quiet. Well, I got there. I loved it. I stayed there for 5 weeks. The first
Mm.
evening I get there, I haven't changed clothes in about 2 days. I haven't shaved. I'm absolutely worn out. I get there in the afternoon. I wake up at 7. I'm starving. I go down to the receptionist and say, "Look, is there somewhere I can eat?" She said, "Yes, there's an Indian." She obviously saw me as an East Indian. She said, "Oh, by the way, there's an East Indian restaurant down the road." And then she looked at my clothes and she said, "Well, it's a high-end East Indian restaurant." I said, "Oh, all right." I walked over there, and you saw all the white people in Cyprus. Of course, they're all Greeks anyway, but they're going into this restaurant, all beautifully dressed. And there I was, smelly. I had Crocs on that were, the strap had come off it. My T-shirt was all wet through, and I was just starving. So I go there, and I'm looking for Indians. There are no East Indians. There's a lady who's all white, and it looks like she's from the Kabuki in Japan. Lots of white makeup on, completely white, black short hair cut down by the neck. And she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "My goodness, what kind of English is that?" Well, it was Cockney English because most of those Greeks, because in Britain, Greek was Cyprus was managed by the British. So the Greek Cypriots would go to England, and somehow or other they landed in East London, which is the Cockney area of England, and they would go there. They'd have all their education. They'd stay there all through winter, and then in summer they'd all come back and open up their shops again for all the tourists to come in, whale over time for 3 months, and go back to England again. So here
Mm.
they were. There was no East Indians. All they were Cockneys. So they marched me down to some corner of the room where I won't be seen, and it's right beside the kitchen door, and it's right in a corner with no windows or anything of the kind, and I'm sitting there. Nobody comes to serve me. I'm like a parcel being waiting to be picked up the next day. So now, suddenly, out of nowhere, here comes this Indian girl, and she's pouring water. She's a water girl, and I say to her, "Are you for real?" And she says, "What do you mean, am I for real?" I said, "Well, are you from India?" She said, "Yes." She says, and I said, "Where in India?" "Oh, Gujarat." I said, "My ancestor came from Gujarat to come to Africa. The British were laying railway lines. They needed
Mhm.
someone as a boundary or a barrier between themselves and the black Africans. And so the whole of these Asian people came. As soon as the railways were loaded, instead of going back to India, all they could find was opening up the little dukas, which were little shops, and they all became entrepreneurs, and they were
Mm.
famous for that.
Wow.
So that was my life. Uh, then my son says to me, "Well, what can you write about?" So anyway, so going back to the story in Cyprus. So I'm sitting there, and this girl comes up to me, and she says she comes from Gujarat. And then she says, "Well, where do you come from?" Now, up to that time, I'd lived in Canada for 20 years, 30 years. I
Mm.
got here at the age of 24 to Calgary. And I'd lived prior to that for about 20 years in England
Mm.
with an English family. I never thought about saying, "Well, I'm from Canada and I have a wife and two kids." Or I come from England. I came from England originally. I left Africa at the age of 5. What came into my mind was this marble palace in Africa. We're on the second floor. It's a huge hall. The floors have all got rush mats on it. The men are sitting on one side, the women are sitting on the other. And this lovely girl who's singing ginans, which were our form of hymns.
Mhm.
And there was so much peace. The windows were open because there was sea breeze coming in because we were in Dar-es-Salam, which was on a beautiful harbor. There was no glass, it was filigree, and all of the breeze was coming in. And it was so peaceful to sit there. So when she asked me where I came from, even though I hadn't gone to the mosque for 30, 40 years, that was the image I got. That is what I got that told me where I came from. So
Mm.
once that happened, I knew now what I wanted to write about. It was going to be called "And Where Are You From?"
Mm.
And it was going to be all the anecdotes and talking about the people that were in my life that would really interest my kid. And so that's how the story started. Well, that's wonderful. It's great to have a starting point, but how do you go on from there? So I sat down. I had bought 15, I don't know, 4 or 5 notebooks. I started the first one and I did about 4 pages and gave up.
Mm.
So those 4 pages were about, oh, it might not be there, about 600 words max.
Right.
And I started writing about this hotel and how I started writing and so on, and left it. My
Mhm.
father died about 3 or 4 years later,
Mm.
and I still hadn't written, and it forced me to go off and do it. And I knew if I sat down in England, oh, in Canada, there's no way that I'd be able to write on my own. So I went out and looked. It took me a year to find someone that I could sit across the table to, and I would then be forced all the weekend to be able to write 3,000 words. I'd go and see her on a Tuesday, and then we'd go backwards and forwards as to what we should and shouldn't write about, and we went
Mhm.
from there.
Mm.
And I didn't know what I was going to write. I didn't know how long I was going to write or how long I was going to stay in this writing business.
Mm.
So all we did was do little chapters, little short stories.
Okay.
Well, you know, to my amazement, she said after about a couple of 2 or 3 months, she said, "These stories are really good." I said, "Really?"
Mm.
Because it's the first time I've ever written anything. She said, anyway, so she said, they're good. I think they're good enough to be published in literary magazines. She said, "I'm going to start sending them out." Well,
Mm.
those stories got published all over the world, from New Zealand to a Danforth Review in Toronto, which is now defunct, all over the States, all over the place. And this is how my writing started. I did one chapter, I did a second chapter, I did a third chapter. And by the time it finished, I'd done 12 chapters, but they all fitted together. When you read the stories, it was amazing how they fitted
Mm.
together. So the way the stories work were, they were short stories. And if you didn't like the first story, you can move on to the second. If you didn't
Sure.
like the second, you can move on to the third. And then I got my own style. And I was so happy with that editor because she allowed me to have my own style. So my style
Mhm.
was like looking at a video camera, looking at the street vendors and looking at others and doing that. And it seemed to work, and it seemed to work in the third person for me.
Mm.
we tried different ways of doing it, and that's what we did, and so that's what we started. Then the next thing was, you know, when I because of my upbringing, when I look at the whites, I look at them through Indian eyes. When I look at the Indians, I look through white eyes. And so many times I've been judged as a stereotype because I'm always in jogging pants. I got, holes in my t-shirt, and people look at me like, yesterday I went to a client of mine, and they're a major engineering company. I do very, very large tax stuff for them.
Mm.
And I went into this place, the dress I was, and the secretary, it was lunchtime, so they had a junior person there, and she says to me, "Who are you?" I says, I've come to pick up a check. Check was on about $100,000. I've come to pick up a check. And she looks at me and she sees this FedEx envelope, which I use as my briefcase with tape all over it, green, whatever, duct tape over it. And she's about to call the police. Anyway, she didn't call the police. She gave it to me. And I said, I don't work for FedEx, I mean, I'm an accountant for all your top engineers here, the founders and everybody else. And she kind of apologized, and,
Mhm.
and all was forgiven after that. But going back to my books. So I write the first book, and I really liked it. I have 15 people whom I give the books to
Okay.
each chapter to, and they give me their opinion. Great. So now I finished that book, but I'm not happy. I'm lazy. I only do 12 chapters. That's all I can afford to do in a book. It wasn't good enough because it wasn't even a novella. It wasn't even 30,000 words. Each story is about 3,000 words.
Right.
So now, give or take. So now I decide I'm going to go to somebody who was a client of mine. I'm an accountant who was a client of mine, and he did illustrations. So I asked him to illustrate the book, which he'd never done, and it came out absolutely gorgeously. So
Mm.
now, and these were my fillers, but they really took the same amount of attention as my writing did. And what he did was, for instance, I said, this is like your book. You do whatever you want to do with it. I don't want to give you any instructions. So the guy comes in, and without unbeknownst to me, he does a history of Cyprus. Now there are 12 civilizations that conquered Cyprus. Cyprus stands for Latin of Cuprus, which is copper. And and Cyprus was taken over time and time again because of its copper.
Mm.
So what he did was he did a framed illustration at the beginning of each chapter. But if you look at those frames, every frame has got a different style to it. Each style represents a particular civilization was in Greece. Now,
Mm.
when I traveled, I used to go in a Comet 4 aeroplane. So what he did was on the inside cover of my large book, he goes and shows a whole bunch of planes rising into the air. And then on the back of it shows all these planes landing. I mean, he put the contributors' names in a golden croc because I always wear Crocs whenever I travel anywhere. So it was a very personal thing. Then he decided, without me telling him, then he decided that that wasn't enough. He was going to take a quote from each chapter, put it at the bottom of the illustration, which is
Oh,
what he did.
nice.
And therefore, it got people totally interested.
Mm.
But I almost lost all the hair I had in my head. It took him about 18 months to do to do these blooming illustrations.
Mm.
And I said, I want something spectacular for a cover. So he comes to me and he gives me a cover. It's a bathtub of all the place. I mean, I've gone to in that book. We've got Dubai, we've got Oman, we've got England, we've got Africa, we've got Philippines, we've got whatever countries you can think of. So what
Right.
he does is he has a bathtub and with a black background, and above it he's got a great big A.
Mhm.
Now, I had a fight with my editor, and he was responsible for making me lose my editor partly.
Mm.
Because he said because my original story was supposed to be "Where are you from?" That was my title, and then because of the way the story is linked together and the answer we came at the end of it, my editor said you should call it Full Circle. I said Full Circle. Who's going to buy a book called Full Circle? So the guy says, why don't you call it from one of the stories? He says, why don't you call it Chasing Aphrodite? Now everything I write, I love my titles.
Mm.
I think of a title and the story comes rather than the other way around. So
Okay.
one of these stories was running from one town to another, looking for Turkish delights, but in fact, they're not allowed. You're not allowed to call them Turkish delights because we're in the Greek area, and Cyprus was partitioned between the Turks and the Greeks. So I had to. I was looking for these fabulous delights, and they were called Aphrodite. So I was chasing after these Aphrodites. So he says, "Well, do that." And my editor says, How can you put chasing Aphrodite? It's got nothing about you chasing girls. I mean, you know, you talk about your life and where you went from the beginning to the end of it. I said, well, that's what I want. So we went in and did the chasing Aphrodite. So go back to your cover. So the cover starts off. It's got a great big A over a bathtub, and I'm saying, oh my God, couldn't you do the towers of Dubai? Couldn't you do something exciting? Who's going to want that with an A on it in the dark? Well, A stood for Aphrodite, of course. Why the
Right.
bathtub? One of the things I was doing was I was taking a bus from Pila to Larnaca and Larnaca on to Nicosia, which the Greeks parts called Lefkosia. So on the way back, it was so hot, it's 41 degrees. I was falling fast asleep. These buses had curtains drawn all across the windows, but they're all tatty curtains with holes in them and everything else. Looks like nobody had ever washed them. So I wake up, I open the curtain, and I see the side of a hill. There's hardly any grass there, but all of a sudden I see these goats. I, well, before I see the goats, I see this tub. It's a bathtub stuck on the side of a hill. I say, what's going on here? I look and I think I'm hallucinating. I then look at the tub, and all of a sudden I've got all these blooming goats drinking from it. So somebody had obviously used this as a trough. And
Mhm.
that took about 3 sentences in the whole of my book, which is over 30,000. That's what he chose. He says, well, I'm visual, so I only go in for things that attract me visually. And I said, "Oh my God. Okay, so tell me what you think." He says, "Well, look," and this guy wasn't philosophical. Right? All he did was
Mhm.
draw and sketch. He was wonderful at that. He says, "Well, think of it this way. You, the bathtub." I said, "Thank you very much." And I'm ugly, but I'm not that way. And I'm not white either. Anyway, he said, "You're the bathtub." He says, all the water in that bathtub are all of your ideas and thoughts to your readers. The goats are the readers coming to you. So it was a metaphor done as an
Mhm.
illustration. I said, look, this is absolutely wonderful, but I don't like it. Go back to the drawing board. Now, all of a sudden, in about 2 months or 3 months, I go to bed at 8. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning. I don't know what happened. I forgot to switch off my phone. 11 o'clock, I get a call. She says, I've got it. I've got it. Could you come over? I said, oh my goodness. What do you want at this time of the night? So I go and see him. It's the most fantastic cover. Have you gone to look at my website? I know you did about
Yeah.
5 minutes before our interview. I saw that you
Yeah.
joined in. I was just, I'm careful about that. Anyway, so you look at the thing, and this thing just leapt at you. Nobody in their right minds would do a cover like it. And what he did was he chose an icon from every chapter. So as you finish reading the book, you are drawn back to the cover to say, I know where that came from. I know where that came
Mm.
from. And
Yeah, very clever.
that rotten guy, clever he may be, the rotten guy, you know what he did? The bathtub still was in the middle of the blooming picture. You look at it,
Yeah.
it's shrunk in size to what he had before, but it's still, everywhere you go, it's still stuck in the middle there. And it's like he's got a floodlight on it, but there isn't a floodlight. So I couldn't complain.
Right.
And it was wonderful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, that's the start of my first book. So now I come
Wow.
to the second book, and
Which is
and
called
which is called Heart of New York. So I
quite a
said to
locale
my
change.
there was a reason for it. So I said to myself,
Okay.
okay, you think you're a great writer, and you've done this wonderful book, and everybody thinks it's wonderful. That's great. So let's prove to yourself whether you're a writer or not. Think of the
Okay.
worst place you want to write about. Think of the worst instances you want to write about. And if you can write a book about that and get away with it, then yes, you're a writer. Now,
Okay.
every summer I was able to take, because I was doing all these other things, I was able to take my kids traveling for 4 or 5 weeks at a time. So you go into one place, sit there for 4 or 5 weeks, then be absorbed in the place and understand the place and so on. Christmas time, we always took them for 2 weeks to the Bahamas, to a place called Paradise Island. You just relax, you do nothing, you get yourself a suntan, you come back to Canada, and everybody's absolutely jealous that you've gone to the Bahamas. So you always got to get a tan to prove to people that you're somebody. So anyway,
Yeah.
we go to Bahamas. This blooming kid of mine, whom I call the monster in my book for a good reason, and the other one I call the poodle. But there's reasons for that, so you got to read the book. So
Okay.
he decides he wants to go to New York at Christmas because he wants to be a rap artist, a rapper, and he wants to go to Harlem there.
Okay.
I go there and it's the most miserable weather that you have ever seen. There's a wind blowing from the Atlantic, there's snow falling everywhere. You cannot look beyond a foot in front of you, and you've always got to look at the floor to make sure that you're not stepping on black ice. And there's a fog.
Okay.
And so I not only wrote about that, I also wrote about my experiences in Canada from getting there in 1980 to the present. But
Okay.
unfortunately, because the weather was cold and the milieu was cold and bleak in New York, all my stories came out as cold and bleak. So I send the first. I send never listen to your friends. That's another bit of advice. That's worth millions. Okay, but I'm telling you that for free. So these guys sit there. These 15 people I've got, I send them the first chapter. All they do is complain. Why can't you write about sunny places? Why can't you write about something that's nice to read about? Why are you doing it? Why are you doing that? I send the second one, the same thing, total disaster. Like, you said, why don't you just hang up your thing? You did a good book, you put your whole life work into it. Now leave it alone. Why do you have to keep writing this stuff? On the fourth chapter, one of the guys phones me. He spends half an hour on the phone complaining about a character called Joe, who was my boss in Calgary. He says the guy was terrible. He used people. He did this. He might have made loads of money, but he did that. He did that. He did the other. I said, "You've just spent half an hour telling me how terrible this guy was. If he was so terrible, why are you wasting half an hour of your time telling me how terrible he was?" Eventually, the thing clicked, or the penny dropped, not something
Right.
clicked. I've been here in Canada for too long. Anyway, so now the guy goes back. And they begin to realize bit by bit, this is not one of these geographical stuff that I do, travelogue that I do. It's really a matter of looking at, you have a certain incident happen to you. What's the moral issue? How would you deal with that kind of an issue? What's right and what's wrong in your eyes?
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden they got it. And they
Right.
began to like the second book more than the first one, because every chapter is somewhere where you do it. And the other thing with the chapters is, and this is what I love to do, is look at someone through very white, prejudiced eyes, turn the whole thing around, and all of a sudden you're looking at it from the other point of view, and suddenly it's clicking that you're wrong one. I have a very quick story. When I first joined an accounting firm in Calgary who hired me from England. I was so bored. I had my own office with a great big glass front onto the corridor, like about 15 people others who were beside me, and then exactly the same furniture, the same color. I got fed up. So I went and got some broken furniture from storage, put it on the floor, and I got bored with that. So then I got myself a 5,000 piece red jigsaw puzzle, all red jigsaw puzzle, and I started fiddling about with it. People walked down the seeing me playing with my jigsaw puzzle with the window down, and they knocked on my door. I said, "You know what? The boss will not like this. A senior partner, John Collins, will not like this. He's going to get mad at you. You can't do this." Well, the next day, the partner walks down. There's a knock on my door, and suddenly all the glass is all darkened. The room is darkened because he was about 6'6", broad shoulders and everything else, and he totally wiped out the glass that was there. So he goes into my room, into my office, and he says, "What a mess!" He looks at the jigsaw. He says, "What a mess!" I said, "Well, I can clear it up." He says, "You got it all wrong." I said, "What do you mean I got it all wrong?" He says, "That's not how you do a jigsaw puzzle." He went from 6'6", he went down to about 2 feet because he was on his knees, because the table was only about a foot above the ground. It was a frame with a piece of wood stuck on it. This is how you do a jigsaw puzzle. You get all the end pieces. Then you put the fit the end pieces. Then you put all the pieces that are the similar shape in rows. That's how you don't do it like this. You have to do it methodically as though you're an accountant. You know the classic line, as though you're an accountant. I said, John, he says, my family has a tradition of doing jigsaw puzzles every Christmas. Every Christmas, bring everybody here. We have a table, we have a huge jigsaw puzzle. Within 2 weeks, the puzzle is done. And this is how you do it. Now, in the meantime, people are wandering up and down the corridor. And then they're stepping backwards to look at this. What the hell are these guys doing? The guy asks me to come with him for lunch straight after that. And I go to, he also invited me to the first Calgary Flames match, I think. At that time, it was a rinky dinky stadium on the Stampede grounds. So the moral of the story is life is a prism. We have to learn to be able to shift it to reflect the colors we want.
Mm,
There is so much generosity and love in people that if you go in assuming the worst is going to happen and they're all selfish, they're all this and they're all that, you know what? That's what you're going to get back. But
right.
somehow or other, if you're able to tap into the goodness in people, the goodness comes out. My English family had 6 kids. They lived in a working class estate. They had no money to rub together, and yet they took me on because they
Mm,
felt that it was needed, and
right.
they took me on and that they had me for at least 10 years of my time, and those are the
Wow.
best years of my life, and
Okay.
and
So,
so many people on my travel did that.
right. And is that the through line through all your books?
It's a matter of trying to look at people in different ways. There's lots of
Okay.
humor, and there's lots of color of stories as well. If you want descriptions of places, it's a great place to escape from,
Right.
and that's what we do.
Okay. So I have to say this has been the easiest interview I've done in my life. I've asked you one question
Oh,
and
can I
you've
can I send can I, yeah, well, can I send you an invoice, or does that come later?
no, yeah. Um, so you've answered a lot of questions I normally would ask as in the course of the interview. Like how you got your started writing and so forth. One thing that's abundantly clear to me listening to you is that you're a natural storyteller. So that talent you've obviously been able to parlay into writing, and it looks like you're having a lot of fun doing it at the same time. Your third book is The Vanished Gardens of Cordova. What's that one about?
When I went to Africa, we had no televisions. So my father, who worked for the airlines, who worked in the cargo department, the cinemas would all have 2 or 3 movies every day. So he'd keep the doors open at 8 in the evening. They would come in, they'd take their reels of film, and they'd take it there. So in return, my father was given free tickets to go to any cinema, and there would have been about 15 or 20 of them in a town of 50,000. And so we would see all the music. The best cinema was a place called Chalks. Chalks was all brand new, all air conditioning. We had our own little balcony to ourselves. And we would
Mm,
watch all the marvelous movies. My favorite movie was Lawrence of Arabia. Now, in Lawrence of Arabia, when Lawrence is with the British Army, he's trying to encourage the Arabs to fight against the Turkish rulers in World War One to create a second front against the Germans and the Turks away from Europe. So he's sitting in the tent, and King Faisal, at that time Prince Faisal, says to him, Lawrence, 900 years ago we were great. In the city of Cordova, it's Cordova today, but at that time they called it Cordova. In the city of Cordova, we had street lighting when London was a mere village. And Lawrence says to him, perhaps it's time to be great again.
mhm,
And he looks at Lawrence and he says, my father is old, and I long for the gardens of Cordova, the vanished gardens. I long for the vanished gardens of Cordova.
mm,
That stuck with me all my life, and I always wanted to go to Cordova. Never went until about 8 years ago when I took all my family there to see it. That's where the title comes from. But okay, so this was going to be. My wife is a nuisance. She's Filipina, but she doesn't want to go to the coast and have a lie down in Spain. No, she wants to go at 41 degrees centigrade temperature. Wants to travel through all of the Arab world to see what they did. The Arabs conquered over half of Spain and administered it for over 400 years. So what they did was they hated the desert. They wanted gardens. They wanted water. So when they went to Spain, they loved it because they created some of the best gardens in the world. One of the most wonderful gardens in the world, which they believe was really heaven on earth. It was their vision of what heaven should be.
Mm.
So they built this fabulous garden in Cordova. Now, every Arab was expected to visit this garden once in their lives because this represented heaven on earth. It was only until later that they would go to Mecca, but this was the place that everybody would be going to.
Okay.
And what I found was it wasn't just a description of all these places and what they'd done and what they hadn't done. What I found was that I, even though I had English education and my favorite hymn was Jerusalem, I then began to click into this Arab world, and I began to be resentful.
Mm.
When I used to go to Africa, we would go to the church. We would wash ourselves even before we went church to the mosque. We'd go to the mosque before we did. We even wash ourselves before we entered. We'd take our shoes off. We'd wash our feet. We would bow obeisance to our God. There was so much peace and quiet in where we went to in our mosque. Now I go to see one of the most beautiful places in Cordova, which is the Alcazar, the huge mosque that they had. Well, the Spanish came in when they took over, destroyed everything they could, and turned everything into a cathedral. So now you're going into these places, and you've got these beautiful arches, all with different lines of different colors on there, and you see gum wrappers on the floor. You see thousands of tourists. You see kids in somewhere where it's supposed to be serene, running around here, there, and there, playing hide and seek. They
Mm.
totally destroyed it. It almost seemed to me as though the Spanish were there to exploit tourists, try and get money from them because the economy was bad. Therefore, they opened these up. But for years, they'd never put anything. There's not a sign anywhere in Cordoba about the street lights. There's not a museum anywhere in there about what the Arabs did. Everything is about the Spanish. It really
Mm.
got to me. Then I looked at myself when I was 5 years old going to England. Nobody knew about the Arabs. The Arabs, as far as they were concerned, were wogs, politely put Western Oriental gentlemen, but it was a word that was there because the British felt that these were nothing, these Arabs were nothing. Nothing talked about the civilization, nothing talked about their greatness, nothing talked about the medicine or the mass or anything of the kind. So
Mm.
automatically, I was ashamed of my own religion. Even if I went back to Africa and I came back in this place where I was the only Indian, I felt I was made to feel subconsciously, not through them telling me, that somehow or other we were inferior. It wasn't until I went to Spain and looked at that and I was able to see what greatness there was in what they did, and then reel back to when I was a kid and how they were looked upon, and in turn how I was looked upon, not by my English family, but those
Mhm.
outside it. And so it
Um,
was a great moment for me of fun. There's a lot of fun in it because, and every story I write, every book I write, it has to have two different components which compare and contrast. So the
okay.
first one was about my family and the people I met before I went to Canada and who are in Africa. The
Okay.
third book was about my accounting experience in England, and it was supposed to be really funny, but it went haywire and it went in its own direction. And that was comparing it to the people I met in Spain. So some of the
Mm.
things I did was one day I arrived at work early. It was my first day. Nobody was there. And the first thing I did was look at the Telegraph cryptic crossword, and I did it in about 5 or 10 minutes. Love doing those things. So the rest of the mob come in at 10 in the morning, and they all sit down. They have their cup of tea. It's typical England, and they have their cup of tea. And they say, "Okay, back to work, guys." So I thought, hey, they're going to help me train or tell me what to do. I'm just sitting at one of the tables. No, they're not. The whole thing was to get together to do to do this bloody crossword. And they looked at it. There was an absolute shock. Said, "Who did this crossword puzzle?" I said, "I did it. I got here an hour early. There's nobody. What was I supposed to do?" They would not talk to me. They had their own little clique. They would not talk to me after that. Anyway, so that's the kind of things I've got.
All right.
Other than that, I've
So
led a boring life.
Yeah, well, you've led a you've led a life that very few have lived, I can say that for sure. Um, so your 3rd book, is it out yet?
Oh, it was out. Yes, it's already out. Yes.
Okay, and, it's available at the usual places?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yep,
such
you
as
can order it.
Amazon, Indigo.
But what I would love your readers to do is go to my website, which is
Okay,
Emil Rem, Emil Rem, Rem .ca, and I would like them to go to a section called Analects. These are the blogs I write every week.
okay,
But each analect has a bit of travel in it, has a bit of politics in it, whatever I feel like writing on the day. And they're
right.
absolutely wonderful and they're all illustrated.
Oh,
And those you can get for free. And I would love you to ask for a free chapter of my book.
okay,
And that way you'll be sent these blogs every week for free.
cool, very cool, and, so where are things sitting with for you now? Are you thinking about a 4th book, or
Oh, absolutely. I've got about 6 more to go. I
Oh
feel
my
like,
goodness.
yeah, exactly. I'm trying to do it before I die. I'm running out of time. So the next one is called Journey Cake, and it's about
Okay,
Christmas spent in Bahamas. I didn't want to write about Bahamas because at Christmas time, you were in fairyland the same way as you were at Disneyland. It was a great version of Disneyland. Loads and loads of people, and you lost yourself. You have no real interaction with local people,
right,
and whatever it was. I was never interested. But then
mm,
all of a sudden, I came across something called Journey. What was it called? It was a cake, Johnny cake, and I'd always wanted to know what Johnny cake meant. On the day that we always arrived in the Bahamas, 2 or 3 days before Christmas Eve, the first thing we do is, even though we're on that island, Paradise Island, we never go to the main hotels places to eat. We go to a local place called Anthony's. So we
mm,
go in there, and my favorite is always having the Cuban bean soup, and with it they come up with a 1 inch thick sponge-like bread, and it's
mm,
about 8 inches in diameter. And in it, they put things like pepper. They put in red peppers, olives, bunch of other vegetables, and everything else. And you slice, and you eat it with your soup. Fabulous. So I asked everybody, where does that name come from? They didn't know. So one day I'm sitting at the dentist. I've got 20 minutes, and I look it up. And you know what it means?
no,
It means journey cake.
mhm,
Journey cake is because there are 700 islands there. And as the Bahamians went from one island to another, they didn't know when they were going to eat next. They would make these cakes that would travel without there being a fridge, and it would last them for a week, possibly 2 weeks. Suddenly, it
wow,
was journey cake. The moment I saw that it was a journey cake, I said, "That's the book I'm going to write about." And what's the story going to be? About the people I meet in Bahamas and all the eccentrics I met along the way, who helped
wow,
me get to where I was in my writing, and all the problems I've had with my writing. I should have given up. And I'm advising anyone who wants to be a writer, don't do it. Do it for a couple of days and then give it up. This is my 7th or 8th year, and I'm still pounding on doors.
right, right.
So
Well,
that's my next one.
yeah, okay, very good. Well, I wish you, all the success with, your, upcoming book and plus the books that you've got out. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention, before I let you
No,
go?
just go and read my analects because I'm really proud of them.
Okay, very good.
And
Well,
of course, buy a dozen books of mine in the
of
meantime.
course, of course. Well, Emil, it's been a pleasure listening to you. You are a natural storyteller, and I assume that comes across in your books as well.
Oh, I hope it does too. All
Yes.
right. Well,
Well,
thank you so much.
yes, very nice, meeting you.
And thank you for your patience as well.
Not a problem, not a
All
problem.
right.
Take care, enjoy the
Thank
rest of your
you.
day.
You too.
Okay,
Thank you so
thank you very
much.
much, Emil.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.